Okay. So I am joined here today by Damien Gérard, who is the Prosecutor General at the Belgian Competition Authority. Before that, he was Deputy Head of Unit at the DG Competition of the European Commission in merger control. And he's also an adjunct professor of EU competition law at the Catholic University of Leuven. So basically a very, very busy man. And so I'm very glad that you're with us here today. Hi, Damien.
Hi, Natasha. Thanks for having me.
So Damien, you joined your agency, I believe, in December of last year in your position. And so already in the middle of the flurry of all the digital legislation or legislative activity that is coming our way, that we are experiencing currently here in Europe. And the Digital Markets Act has now been passed by the Parliament just this week with a vast majority. And I think it might be published, in the official journal as early as October, perhaps, of this year, after ratification by the member states. So it is undeniably marching forward. I wanted to see with you to what extent our national competition authorities, of course, the enforcement and oversight lies with the Commission, but to what extent are national competition authorities going to be involved in the enforcement of the incoming DMA, and what competencies do you have?
Right.
Will you have?
Right. Thanks, Natasha. No, indeed. I mean, this podcast is very timely because yesterday, in fact, the Parliament voted overwhelmingly to pass the DMA, and all eyes now are focused on enforcement, right? And there have been all kinds of discussions on resources that the European Commission will need to devote to this huge task. Now, maybe you remember that about a year ago, national competition authorities, published a paper essentially arguing that the Commission will not be able to take ownership and implement effectively the DMA on its own, and that it should rather join forces with national authorities, and at least the national authorities are certainly capable of helping and supporting the Commission in that endeavor. Now, what's remarkable under the DMA is that the European Commission, in fact, is the sole authority empowered to enforce the DMA. So it's supposed to act as a full-fledged regulator, and it's in fact the only authority empowered to adopt decisions, right? But another remarkable feature is that the DMA integrates what is known as the European Competition Network as the main enforcement cooperation framework, within the DMA. So you really have an instrument created under another piece of legislation which is integrated into the DMA. It's been working in the field of competition enforcement for more than 20 years. It works remarkably well. And so it's going to be used also to facilitate the coordination between the Commission and national competition authorities, in particular, within the framework of the DMA. And so specifically, what will national competition authorities do? Well, as I said, national competition authorities cannot adopt decisions. I mean, they will be involved in the advisory committee that will sort of vet the draft decisions by the Commission. But that's let's say something quite specific, though important. But practically, there are three ways in which national competition authorities will be involved. The first one, national competition authorities are supposed to be the first contact points for third parties, that is chiefly users, right? So they will receive complaints, they will receive alerts, also under the whistleblower directive, and national competition authorities are entitled to investigate, these complaints, these alerts, all the kinds of tips that they may receive. And then the only limitation is that they have to report their findings to the Commission, and only the Commission can then sort of take over and eventually adopt a decision. The second type of involvement of national competition authorities is really assistance in supporting the European Commission in carrying out a broad range of investigative tasks, inspections, market investigations, etc., etc. And then the third aspect is that national competition authorities can join forces to trigger market investigations into the designation of gatekeepers, into systemic non-compliance with the DMA, the expansion of the scope of DMA obligations, etc., etc. So these are, let's say, the three main ways in which NCAs will be involved. I mean, obviously, NCAs will also have to work in close cooperation with national regulators, but we can discuss this separately. And national competition authorities will also, of course, continue to enforce national competition law, also against practices of gatekeepers, though they will have to do so in close cooperation with the Commission, and will have to, in fact, notify the Commission of any actions on the antitrust side that they intend to adopt towards so-called gatekeepers in the future.
Interesting. So definitely lots of parallels to actual competition law, I would say, as well, and the enforcement and the way it works. I mean, when you read the enforcement powers in the DMA, it reminded me a lot of obviously what we know from competition law. But you did mention resources. And as you say, there's a lot of discussion immediately after the act was passed by the Parliament. There was discussions on how many people are needed to enforce this at a competition level, etc. But as you say, it will also affect your agency. So what are you doing on your level, on your agency level, to prepare for this incoming additional task that you have to fulfill?
Right. No, sure. I mean, it's in full swing, I would say, in the sense that it's been adopted by the Parliament yesterday. We expect indeed the final ratification, as you said, at the level of the Council, and publication sometime early October, and then publication will follow 20 days after entry into force. Within 60 days, it's going to be applicable, and then gatekeepers will have to notify, and then the Commission will have 45 days to designate the gatekeeper. So everything will happen pretty fast in the coming month. And so what we're busy with currently is really discussing with the National Ministry for Economic Affairs, which is essentially holding the pen of the legislation that will sort of implement the DMA at national level here in Belgium, for example. Now, implementation is a bit of a curious word to use for a European regulation, which is supposed to be directly applicable, but essentially it's about easing up the implementation of the DMA also, and the enforcement of the DMA by national authorities. So it's essentially about who is going to be responsible for what when Belgium as a member state is supposed to be involved in facilitating the enforcement of the DMA. So it's about giving the relevant authorities, that is including the Belgian Competition Authority, the necessary powers to assist the Commission under the DMA and to carrying out all kinds of investigative actions under the DMA. So there will need to be some piece of national legislation, I assume, in pretty much every member state. Plus, member states will have to coordinate their different authorities and have put in place a sort of a cooperation mechanism at national level between the competition authorities, the sector regulators, the data protection agencies. So all that needs to happen in the coming month, but it's more a matter of weeks than months, I would say. So that's essentially what's currently happening. And at all level, I mean, clearly we have to set up a task force and staff a task force of people who will be involved in the process. In many ways, including those I've just described, but others as well. I mean, you're certainly aware of the fact that on the merger control side, there will also be actions to be taken whenever the Commission will inform the member states of the fact that gatekeepers are undertaking M&A transactions in the digital field. Some of these transactions might not be reviewable at EU level from the merger control perspective. They might be reviewable at national level, but then at national level, we can also refer back transactions to the Commission. So all these all this mechanism will need essentially to be put in place and implemented practically at national level. And then, as I mentioned before, we will clearly have to put in place the modalities of cooperation with national regulators. That is, sector, sector regulators in charge of, media, telecom, etc. Let's say the more IT/digital economy, but also data protection agency. So, and clearly in Belgium, for example, the different regulators will have to cooperate to define what will be the position of Belgium in the advisory committee, for example. But what I expect is that this closer cooperation will have spillover effects into our antitrust enforcement as well. And so I think we're going to interact much more closely in the future, not only with the sector regulator, but also the data protection agency. So so that's essentially what I can say of what is happening concretely at national level at this moment.
That's really interesting. I was actually going to be, so you sort of segued into my next question and already answered it. So I was going to ask you, to what extent there is already cooperation going on between, your colleagues on the national level and you, for instance, in preparation. Are there any sort of knowledge sharing meetings that are currently ongoing? And then second part of that question was whether this is also already happening, for instance, with sectoral regulators such as the data protection. The data protection has a very prominent mention throughout the DMA, and the DMA is obviously without prejudice to, data protection law, and so the national data protection agencies will have to play quite a substantial role. And I would imagine that there has to be regulatory cooperation, knowledge sharing, etc., on how to do that so that this is effective. For you, but also for those you are regulating, and doesn't, overlap in that sense. So I was just wondering if there were already any activities ongoing, or is there anything in the planning for this kind of cooperation?
Right. No, sure. I mean, look, in Europe, you have different models at play at national level. I mean, you have certain member states which have integrated the different sector specific regulators, sometimes including, I think, the data protection agency, sometimes not. So, and others still work with, autonomous, independent sector specific regulators and data protection agencies. That's the case in Belgium. We have cooperation agreements, for example, with the telecom regulator that enables us then to cooperate on particular cases, exchange information, and we do that on a very, very regular basis. Mm-hmm. With the data protection agency, not so much up to this point, and I think that's been a bit of a problem in a number of prominent antitrust cases and merger control cases in recent years, right? And that prompted also sometimes so there was a bit of friction sometimes from the competition authorities, between the competition authorities and the data protection authority. I anticipate that this friction will largely disappear in the future, simply because competition authorities and data protection agencies will have to cooperate, much more in enforcing the DMA, with spillover effects into antitrust enforcement. But at this point, as I said, at least at Belgian level, what we're busy with is putting together a scheme, a cooperation scheme between the different regulatory agencies, and once this is in place, then and once the DMA enters into force, well, the cooperation will need to start up, and we will definitely, as I said, cooperate in defining a common position to defend within the advisory committee, then involving the sector regulators, including the Data Protection Agency, into our investigations. So, things are taking shape. They're not yet operational, obviously, because the DMA still won't enter into force until later this year. But my understanding is that at national level, everybody's busy trying to set up, the most efficient structure possible to enable cooperation across regulatory authorities.
Yeah, the UK has an interesting model in the DRCF that includes all the digital regulators, and they engage in common, knowledge sharing, but also horizon scanning, not particular to one legislative piece as we are looking at here, but more in general, which I think is an interesting model to look at and draw inspiration from for the future of this as well. Last question.
If I may,
yes.
In fact, under the DMA, there is also this interesting also cooperation framework called the High-Level Group for the DMA, which will integrate a number of different bodies, European but also national, with a prominent role, I think, for data protection agencies there as well. And so it's going to be an advisory body, but with pretty wide powers, and also the responsibility to ensure a form of convergence between regulatory approaches, which are at play across the different fields. I think that is really interesting, because the DMA could sort of work as a way to ensure convergence across the different approaches and enable really mutual learning. I mean, a lot will be about knowledge sharing and sharing of expertise, and I think the DMA through the High-Level Group is really designed to sort of enable that knowledge sharing and sort of enabling all the authorities to stepping up really their cooperation. So we'll see how it plays in practice, but at least it's how it's designed on paper.
And I think it's necessary because, as you said, many of the fields are starting to flow together, and this requires cooperation and dialogue, I think, between the different regulators. Last question, and perhaps that you already partially answered that, but Executive Vice President Vestager told the Parliament this week, the proof of the laws in the enforcement. And so we just discussed that a little bit, but maybe some blue sky thinking from your side. Where do you see the main challenges for your agency, but maybe also, in the broader sense, for your former colleagues at the Commission, with the DMA coming into force?
Right. I mean, look, the main challenge is that, this has to work, right? And everybody, is now willing to contribute to the success of the DMA simply because, it's such an important piece of legislation. It's also a bit of a, a first, and everybody's watching essentially. So, clearly it's a huge challenge, but we have to succeed, and we have to succeed together. So, so that's I would say the main challenge. Now, there are many unknowns, obviously, still at this point. It's not very clear, how gatekeepers or prospective gatekeepers will actually react, whether there will be litigation on the legality of the DMA, whether they will, gatekeepers will be forthcoming or rather resisting, whether they will use the DMA as a form of cooperation framework with the regulators, as a forum for dialogue and for productive dialogue with regulators or not. So this is all to be seen, but there are other unknowns. For example, private enforcement. This is a piece of EU regulation that can certainly give rise to private enforcement actions, and the DMA provides also for cooperation mechanism between the Commission and national courts. So we'll see how that happens. Other unknowns is the the interactions related to the interactions with other regulatory regimes around the world, right, in the future, whether it's in Australia, Japan, at some point in the US, maybe, and elsewhere. And how this sort of patchwork will influence the position that different gatekeepers will take in individual cases and in individual jurisdictions, including in Europe. So my sense is that there will need to be at some point a form of cross-border cooperation between different agencies from around the world. You know, but before we get there, obviously there are all kinds of other cooperation mechanisms that can be put in place, and some are already in the making. So that's also another known, and yeah, to be seen why and to what extent. So sorry, whether and to what extent, you know, the fragmentation, if you want, of the regulatory framework can have an impact on its effectiveness at for us European level. So these are all kinds of unknowns, and that's what makes it particularly exciting as well. We'll see how things go, but as I said, you know, the mindset is very much, I believe, that it has to work. You know, cooperation is already underway between national competition authorities and the Commission through the ECN, and everybody is getting prepared. And yeah, happy to reconvene in a few months to see in practice how things are going.
Excellent. It definitely remains interesting and exciting. So thank you so much, Damien, for your thoughts today and for your time. And I wish you a good afternoon.
Thanks very much, Natasha.